Good afternoon and welcome to Asia Society Australia and today's program on disrupted supply chains. I'm James Scullen, the Program Director here at Asia Society Australia. Before we begin, Asia Society acknowledges that many participants in today's event are dialing in from locations that have traditional owners and custodians. Today, I'm speaking to you from the Bunrawong and Wurundjeri lands of the East Kulin Nation, and I acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Now, this is the first program in our series on supply chains that will run throughout 2022. With thanks to support from our partnership with Global Victoria's Trade Alliance Initiative, we'll be bringing you expert insights, briefings, and policy papers on the fast evolving and often turbulent world of global supply chains, with a focus on Australia and Southeast Asia. With global shortages on consumer goods and medical supplies, ranging from PPE equipment, surgical masks, electronic chips for new vehicles, iPhones, toilet paper, and any number of potential Christmas presents, many consumers around the globe have been given a crash course on the potential impact of disrupted supply chains. Although COVID-19 has exacerbated supply chain vulnerabilities, many issues around supply chains have been simmering away amidst technological disruption, geo-economic competition, and an increasingly complex global trading environment. On this program, we'll be looking to take stock of 2 years of disruption, its impact on Australia, and what global products have been most hard hit. Our expert panel will also be taking a look at just how vulnerable Australian supply chains are and what Australian exporters can do to mitigate risk and achieve supply chain diversification in an increasingly unpredictable trading environment. As part of our partnership with Global Victoria's Trade Alliance project, we've been able to onboard 2 Asia Society Supply Chain Fellows who are both with us today. The first of those, Dr. Hermione Parsons, has an extensive background in supply chains, including roles at the Melbourne Market Authority, Supply Chain Careers for Women Initiative, VicTrack's Advisory Committee for Freight and Logistics, the Supply Chain Advisory Network, and Australia's National Freight Data Hub Advisory Group. Hermione is also recognised as one of the 100 most influential women in supply chain, and she will moderate today's session. Our second supply chain fellow, Dr. Vinh, is an associate professor at the School of Accounting, Information Systems and Supply Chain at RMIT University. He's currently an associate editor of the Asian Journal of Shipping and Logistics and is known internationally for his research in logistics and supply chain management. Vinh has published more than 140 international peer-reviewed journal articles and conference papers in leading academic publications. Joining our supply chain fellows today, Dr. Roberto Perez Franco, a senior research fellow at the Centre for Supply Chain and Logistics at Deakin University. Roberto has extensive expertise in the assessment and reformulation of supply chain strategies for organizations, and his supply chain strategy ideas have been taught at MIT and deployed by organizations such as BASF, Intel, 7-Eleven, Cardinal Health, Saflex, and the United Nations. And finally, Suresh Nanoo is the CEO of Century Batteries Malaysia, one of the market leaders in automotive batteries. Suresh works with his organization and customers to optimize their distribution channels as they work through a turbulent business environment, managing the intricacies of operational supply chain issues. Suresh was previously regional brand head at Visa International for Asia Pacific and Singapore, and headed retail banking in HSBC Philippines and at Qatar National Bank. For a full view and the full expertise of all our speakers, please be sure to click on the link we're sharing with you now to read their full bios. Throughout our panel discussion today, please feel free to submit any brief questions or comments in the Q&A box below your screen, and our moderator will endeavour to incorporate them into today's discussion. Thanks again for tuning into today's program. It's great to have you with us, and Hermione, it's now over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you indeed. And thanks to our speakers. Roberto, thank you for connecting us through your colleagues in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, to Suresh. And thank you very much for joining us, Suresh. We're really pleased to have you here. Thank you. And Vinh, of course, a pleasure as my fellow. As an island nation, Australia's been hit hard. And it's the tyranny of distance that has really hit us hard again through the pandemic. When Australia went into lockdown, the airlines stopped travelling. 92% of airline travel ended on one day. That meant passengers, of course, stopped traveling, but it also meant freight. Imports and exports couldn't get into and out of Australia. At the same time, ships stopped coming because the ports were closed because of the pandemic, and the hubs and spokes networks that connect Australia exporters and Australian importers with Southeast Asian countries and vice versa was in an imperiled situation. Now we have a situation where we have great problems in Australia getting ships on schedule. We have shortages of ships, of containers, of pallets, of ship trips, of spaces. We have great problems with empty containers. We have delays. And even recently, you know, when the Suez Canal was blocked, the blockage of the Suez Canal for that short period of time has been modelled by Drury to equal a full year of the world's containers are now blocked in backlog, in delays. So these things all have, you know, we're a global system, so everything is connected to the next thing. In Australia, we have truck shortages, driver shortages. This is endemic across the world. And then we have, of course, every time the pandemic hits again in any location, we have the problem that we're all human. So it could be the crews or the distribution centres or the ports or the hubs or spokes networks of workers that are stopped, and therefore our supply chains are disrupted. So it is an extraordinary time for us all, for all supply chain people, never mind for those people relying on freight or exporters or importers. And of course, if we put government into that mix too, we are all in a new situation. Even though we've had it for about a year or so, it's still new to us all. Before the pandemic, no one much knew about supply chains and freight logistics. We were the hidden enabler. And before the pandemic, there were people like our centre, for Roberto and I work at the Centre for Supply Chain Logistics. Our centre was imploring government to spend more time in understanding this critical part of the economy. Now supply chain is everywhere. Communities know about supply chain. People talk about it all the time in one way or another. So we have a very different circumstance now to, say, 2 years ago. The first question I'm going to put to each of you is, why is the issue of supply chain disruption important to business and society? And why should we care about supply chains? Roberto, can I ask you to address this question first? Maybe about a minute or so for you each, and I'll ask each of the three of you.
Yes, thank you, Hermione. I think the question of why supply chain matters is, it may have been a little abstract and esoteric 2 years ago, but now it's a very immediate and visceral answer that anybody can give. Supply chains are the veins and the blood of our societies, of our economies. And I'm not exaggerating here when I say this. Just like the blood and the veins are the transport system for the body that move all the ingredients the body needs, all the oxygen, the food, the nutrients, and remove the what is not needed. Similarly, supply chains move everything we need, and for citizens, for business, for government to run and to operate. It is very easy to think of economies from the transactional point of view, of people buying things and taking ownership of things, but that means nothing if the goods are not moved and delivered. And that's the part that has been impacted now. And we have had this, I say we as a society have had this rude awakening, even though a few of us were already working in this space even before the disruption. So I think it's a teachable moment for our decision makers in government and in companies and in communities. Probably it has taught them that supply chains play a fundamental role in the standard of living that we enjoy, in the quality of our lives, in the prosperity of our economies, as the enabler of trade, and I would say the protection of our quality of life. The food, the medicines, the clothes, the entertainment, everything ties back to supply chain. So that's why it's important that we have supply chains.
Thank you very much. Vinh, can I hand over to you? Why should we care about supply chains?
Yes, Hermione, thanks for that. And just to add on what Roberto had just elaborated, I think everyone should care about supply chain. And the simple reason is that if there are no supply chains or supply chains are being disrupted we are seeing now, there will be shortage and delay from farm to fork, from seller to buyer, and eventually majority of commodities that we can think of in our daily life would not arrive, or if they do, they will come late, not at the time that we want. Like the situation that we are seeing right now for the Christmas shopping, right? So that in itself highlight the essential role that supply chain will play in the national economy, regional economy, and the economy of every families here in Australia as well as elsewhere in the world. That's my view.
Thank you very much, Vinh. Suresh, can I ask you this question? Why should we care about supply chains? Suresh, you're on mute. Thank you.
Sorry, I think what Roberto and Vinh have said makes a lot of sense. I can just add by saying that we care about supply chains because at best, a broken one can probably affect the arrival of your Christmas presents. But at worst, it can cause lives and affect livelihoods across the economy, across the world, and things like medicines and equipment fail to arrive on time. And as we learn about supply chains, we learn that systems relying on precision as they continue to improve are the most susceptible to disruption, ironically.
Thank you. And we'll come back to you in a moment for more around those subjects, around that topic. Roberto, as we approach 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen major changes and disruptions to global supply chains. Can you take us through some of those? And is it fair to call the current situation a crisis? Is it fair to call the current situation unprecedented? Is it over? Is it towards the end? How do you see the situation in terms of major changes, major disruptions?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the nature of the disruption we have seen is multiple. For example, at the beginning of the conversation, James mentioned toilet paper. The scarcity of toilet paper in Australian shelves, as well as in Europe and the US, is a demand side problem. There is a lot of panic buying, people that see in the news that some people are panic buying paper and they want to buy paper so that they are not left out. And it creates a fake scarcity because of the panic buying. Other disruptions, however, do not have their origin on the demand side, but on the supply side. For example, the scarcity of PPE, of masks, of hand sanitizer, of ventilators, that is a supply problem. There is a supply of masks and sanitizer that produces a certain level for the normal demand. When the pandemic hit, the demand skyrockets, multiplies tenfold, probably 100-fold, and supply takes a time to ramp up. And that limitation in supply created also a problem. We also saw that one. The one that we're experiencing right now, however, is different from the demand side and the supply side issues. It involves basically the whole chain, including those elements in the middle, such as ships and ports and containers. The disruptions we're seeing now are ports that are blocked, ships that are waiting at sea to unload. We are seeing empty shelves just in major stores, unavailability of products such as diapers or cars, and also an increase in shipping costs. So I would say it is fair to call this a crisis, and I think it is certainly unprecedented in the sense that, for example, people that have been working in ports for 20, 30 years have never seen hundreds of ships waiting out in sea, in the US, for example. So it is unprecedented. It is not, however, unexplainable or mysterious. It is the consequence of the system we have in place, which is a market-driven system. It's a for-profit system for the most part, and where players are taking individual decisions that are not coordinated globally, because it is actually a collection of smaller transport and supply markets. And this is the result of operating in an environment of high uncertainty. Some assumptions were made at the beginning of the pandemic about what the economy was going to look like. Many producers and transporters thought we were going to see a diminished economic activity, and they dialed back their production, or they laid aside some ships or planes. And when the demand ramped up because people kept buying, basically they had to restart the production. And now we're seeing the pipeline, which had been basically emptied, starting to fill up again. And there is a delay in that filling up. And that's why we're going to see some ripple effects going forward. Regarding whether it's already over, or I think we haven't seen the worst of it, but at the same time, we are already seeing the signs of recovery. But that recovery will take months to ripple through all the way to the end of the chain. I think we may still be seeing some scarcity even in the end of next year, but I do think that the healing has already started. And even though the wave of scarcity has not broken yet, the pipeline is being replenished.
Thank you very much. Vinh, can I ask you, would you like to add anything to that, please? With the current situation, is it unprecedented? How do you see the next 6 months, 12 months? How do you see it moving along?
Yes, thank you, Hermione. I think the changes or the disruption to global supply chains that we are referring right now, they actually started around September, October last year, 2020, after a period of drop in demand due to lockdown and other social restriction measures. And then we have seen the demand suddenly spike together with other problems on the supply side that Roberto mentioned earlier. And when we say problem on the supply side, they actually happen in every sector of the supply side. So say, for example, we see the shortage of computer chips, shortage of empty containers, shortage of transport capacity, and then congestion at port as well. All of those actually lead to the situation that we are facing today, and we feel it in Australia, that there are either shortage or non-availability of various consumer and industry products like electronic, clothing, food, toys, book. And now we even see the shortage of timbers and the pallet inside the container as well. So in my view, it is actually truly a crisis, because it's happening on a wider scale, especially in a consumer country such as Australia. And I would say this is quite unprecedented, not because it's not happened before, but because of its magnitude. And similar to Roberto, my view is that we have seen some signs of recovery, but it is not going until the end of next year, if not moving into 2023, that we'll start to see some signs of fully recover back to normal.
Thanks, Vinh. Thank you. And it is this critical issue of the interdependencies, isn't it? And a global supply chain, a global system of trade, where we are each country, each state, each city is dependent upon the rest of the world and componentry from all sorts of different places. So it's this interdependency about supply chain, which I think is actually one of the reasons people love working in supply chain, because it's complex. It's always complex, much more complex at the moment. But it is certainly an extraordinary sets of relationships and different tiers of relationships at play at all times, which makes it so fascinating, but also so very difficult in the current environment. Suresh, I'd like to ask you to address the following question, please. As a business executive of a company located in Asia, which is Century Batteries, how have you been affected by the current issues around supply chains, and how have you attempted to mitigate the impact? Over to you.
Well, let me unmute. Thank you for that. As some background to put this into context, so that everybody will understand where I'm coming from, the group manufactures and distributes lead-acid batteries for the automotive industry. So we have a centralized manufacturing facility located in the Philippines, and they serve landed operations in Malaysia, Australia, and the USA. In Malaysia, it's the Century brand, while in Australia, we don't own that brand, instead distribute, supercharge, and excite. But we have over 100 SKUs, so there is complexity in terms of the types of equipment that we sell. As the leading brand in the country, we have been affected negatively by the pandemic, definitely. The impact has been, as Roberto and Vinh have said, demand volatility, inventory chaos, raw material supply shortages, and workforce productivity, which include, a hidden aspect which is now emerging, which is really mental health issues associated with workforce productivity. The first thing that we did was actually map our supply chain, its dependencies and vulnerabilities. And that would be a good piece of advice to anyone in our shoes now that are facing the kind of chaos that we see. Fortuitously, actually, the group has always built self-sufficiency into its business model because they were based in the Philippines, which does not have a strong industrial infrastructure. So the ensuing vertical integration, if you like, has been a point of contention in the past, but in hindsight, it's turned out to be a bit of a blessing. If we look at what we need and what we have produced ourselves. So the major components of our business are lead, acid, plastic containers, and other small components. And we have largely been self-sufficient. We have 4 recycling plants, lead recycling plants in the major countries. We have a sizable acid plant. Plastic containers and molds are produced internally. But the first item that we saw as being a critical part in us getting back to normalcy was actually settling the manpower and production, which had the longest lead times. So ensuring that we had enough finished inventory for what was a very volatile demand curve meant that we had to stabilize manpower, attendance, and productivity in a place in Southeast Asian countries which were very badly hit. As an example, Malaysia has 2.6 million cases of COVID, which is about 8% of the population, and 30,000 deaths, which is huge. So the action plan was really to stabilize manpower. So we built dormitories on site with food, transportation provided. We had an on-site medical clinic with the rapid test kits, and we had 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off with quarantine SOPs, strict, such that we could, in fact, manage the production. Now, once that was stabilized, then we could start concentrating on the supply side. And the biggest issue that we had there was for a component which we call separators in the production of batteries. And they were, in fact, something that we couldn't produce and we imported from China. And so what we then immediately decided at the same time was to overorder, as everybody did, build up inventory, cheaper than building a factory. So we stabilized that, and we looked at how we could improve our inventory on all the raw materials. Shipping was and continues to be the most problematic area. Shippers increased costs. We experienced numerous delays. We had a backload strategy where we would export lead and import the batteries on the same containers. But with the disruptions, we just could not coordinate that with the shippers because their transshipments, their timing of container shipments was all broken and erratic. So the mitigant was really just to increase in-transit and on-the-ground inventory, and we transported lead out whenever shipping was available. Now, freight forwarders with a good understanding and relationship with customs in each of the countries, more so in Southeast Asia, I think, makes all the difference in port clearance and in ensuring that you actually get your stuff through. And so a good partnership there is very vital. Now, in local distribution, which is where the landed operations are, the imposition of travel restrictions between towns and states caused an initial problem, but we successfully repositioned our product as critical and obtained waivers from the police and other authorities to supply to critical customers such as ambulances, military, the police. And so by repositioning that, we managed to get the waivers, which later progressed to other service categories. We also took the opportunity with our distributors who were impacted by the pandemic because of the vagaries of demand to embark on joint venture negotiations. So we started to talk about taking equity in some of their businesses, which were clearly in trouble, and embed ourselves further into the distribution network downstream. We set off from the start that there were no layoffs on staff. Natural attrition, yes. We accepted reduced profitability, but staff confidence was high, and that was the payoff. Fortunately for us, in terms of competition, the major competition was importers of batteries from India, Indonesia, and China, all of whom had more severe issues than we had, and which meant that we had the ability to hang on to our distributions and, in fact, load them up with inventory ahead of time so that their pressures would be less. Now, I think we all talked about the issues of the pandemic, but one of the areas which I would like to talk about as being positive outcomes would be the fast-forward digitization across the economy.
How about we come to that later? Because
Okay.
I really want to explore that, if you would. You've given
Sure.
us some fantastic, people who are attending this forum, some fantastic ideas already about the, if we can say there are any benefits coming or the positives coming for businesses to really understand the human dimensions, understand the power of mapping, etc. But I'd love to bring those comments back in at the end of the session, if you wouldn't mind, Suresh. But
Absolutely.
a fascinating description of your company. And what I think was so clear was, when we first think about batteries, you think, yeah, okay, batteries then you realize the profound dependency of our society for ambulances, for defense, for everyone on the product that you produce. So it's the dependency and the interdependencies of every aspect of human society that we've seen being impacted by this pandemic. But that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Suresh. Thank you. Vinh, over to you. Will we see a return to pre-pandemic conditions as we enter an era of living with COVID? What does the current supply chain crisis say about the state of globalization? And I'll just get you to do maybe 1 or 2 minutes on this, and we'll keep moving with the other questions that we planned. Yes?
Sure. Thanks, Amani. As we have seen, and it has been repeatedly mentioned everywhere, we are entering the era of living with COVID, or, very frequently we say the new normal. So my personal view is that we may be able to return to the pre-pandemic condition from as early as 2023. However, in my view, the supply chain will no longer be the same because there will be certainly some restructuring and re-strategizing in global supply chain. Lots of companies will look to build their supply chain. We can be more flexible and react more swiftly to disruption. And as regard to globalization, in my opinion, globalization will not stop, but perhaps will transform. For example, we may see more regional trade, and at the same time, nearshoring and onshoring may rise up as well. That's my view.
Thank you very much. I'd like to add, I put a question to you all now. Do you see, often the discussion around Australia is that we need more onshoring, and worldwide, we've seen what the US has been doing, and this part of the discussion is forefront of lots of people's thinking. Very interesting what you've said about globalization not stopping, Vinh. I would agree with you absolutely. Well, I'm going to quickly ask, very quickly ask you one question, 1 minute each. What do you see about the issue of onshoring? Do you see this as the panacea that a lot of people are speaking about? Do you think of it as a very sensible risk management strategy? What do you think about this sort of onshoring versus sort of globalization tension that is in the discussions at the moment? Over to you, Roberto.
Yeah, I think the issue of onshoring is an easy distraction. If you don't have the ingredients to manufacture the thing, it doesn't matter that you have the machine to produce it here if you don't have the ingredients. If you don't have the chemical that you need, or the component that you need, or the fiber that you need. So the reality is that in a place like Europe, for example, if you could say, well, can we manufacture this within Europe? Yeah. Can we manufacture this within North America? Let's say Mexico, US, and Canada. Yeah, these are huge markets, hundreds of millions of people, highly industrialized. In the case of Australia, I do not think you can plausibly have any significant improve of your resilience by just moving manufacturing capacity locally, unless you have an vertically integrated localization where every single component is produced here. And since that is not possible, then I think what we need to have is a more strategic stockpiling of critical elements. Right now, we are flying with very low inventory levels, just-in-time philosophy. Just-in-time doesn't fly in times of a pandemic or a global disruption. So we need to revisit the idea of safety stockpiles, of strategic stockpiles, of critical components. I think that, and not in local manufacturing, lies the solution.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you. Suresh, can I ask you a quick question? From a Southeast Asian perspective, how do you see this topic of onshoring? And I'd particularly like you to think about it or reflect on it in terms of labor and the cost of labor. Could you look at it in that way, maybe? Or how do you see onshoring as a possibility? You're muted again, Suresh. Sorry, I should have a... isn't it the expression of our year? You're on mute. Over to you, Suresh.
Yeah, I think it's a factor of the population and the economies that you can bring with either onshoring or maybe lesser onshoring, but regionalizing. So within ASEAN, you have a block of countries that have some, infrastructure around free trade and that ability to bring a bigger market onto whatever you're producing, and the proximities within them are not huge. There is quite good land access to the countries, and that is more a natural, I would think, outcome rather than within each country. So we're starting to look for bigger blocks of economies, if you like.
Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. A question. How vulnerable are Australia's supply chains going forward? Vinh, can I get you to address this one?
Yes, thanks, Amani, for the question. I think as recently released a report from the Productivity Commission in Australia, they have in their report, which is very comprehensive, and they have identified the so-called vulnerable supply chains, which I'd like just to reiterate here. It has been identified in that report for import, why in fact import is predominantly sourced from one trading partner, and 1 in 20 Australian import might be vulnerable to concentrated sources of global supply. The main supply chain disruption risks are to the health, water, energy industry, with you import of chemical product in production, and some of which are likely to be vulnerable to a single source of supply. So that is from the import side in Australia. Now for export, they have also identified that nearly 1 in 5 of Australia goods export are highly concentrated. And among Australian main good export, only iron ore is identified as vulnerable, and export income could be jeopardized by disruption to the supply of imported input. And which has been identified in the report, the country's main export industry use 66 vulnerable import in production, and the main upstream disruption risks are to the mining industry, which use imported chemical products in production, and some of which have been identified as vulnerable. So this is basically, the findings from that comprehensive report that I just would like to reiterate over here.
Thank you, Vin. Thanks very much. A quick comment from you, Roberto. How vulnerable are Australia's supply chains?
Yeah, I think that if we don't learn some key lessons, we're going to be as vulnerable as we were before. Australia has some pre-existing risk factors, which you mentioned at the beginning, Hermione. Our distance, we're far from many other demand centers. Our nature as an island, and the fact that we don't manufacture a lot locally. So we are dependent for what we sell and what we buy. And I think some of the lessons that we have to learn are that the global supply chains are not a coordinated, optimized system. They are a collection of market profit-driven, smaller entities, and that they can fail under global disruption conditions. And I think what that means is that the religion of just in time needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. We need to rethink the idea of having safety stocks, of having redundancies, of having a variety, a portfolio of options for our transport, for our storage, for our production. And also the idea of a quick delivery of shorter lead times, etc., may have to come with an asterisk that this is subject to the conditions. Under disruptions, the delays may be longer. I am actually, Hermione, happy to see that the key things like food and medicine, by and large, have not been absent. We have had access to those. It's okay to go without a PlayStation or a new car. But I think as long as we look after the key elements, the strategic elements, we'll be fine. So yes, we can make our supply chains more robust and more resilient, but let's give them credit. Actually, they performed rather well considering what was thrown at them.
Thank you very much. And I think you're quite right too. If we drew that across to the parallel of our ports, a lot of the time now in Australia, there's a comparison, there's a tendency to try and compare our ports, the ports of Australia, to the ports of massive ports of different parts of the world. And the comparisons are often unfair and incorrect, but we're actually faring pretty well. We've been doing really quite well, except say when we're talking about highly perishable products, exports and imports that we're desperately needing fast. So there's some really big issues that importers and exporters are dealing with when they're relying, of course, on air freight, but also sea freight. But relative to other countries, I do agree that we are doing a little bit better or somewhat better. Can we turn our attention now to mitigating supply chain risk and say the role of government and the policy tools that are possible? And we've got about 5 or 6 minutes to sort of explore these issues before we get to a final question, which is your advice to Australian exporters. So if we look now at how can businesses mitigate supply chain risk, I'm going to ask Suresh. You were starting to go down this path before, mitigating supply chain risk. What are some of the positives that have come out of this dreadful situation in terms of supply chain efficiencies or in terms of businesses coping with this crisis? Over to you, Suresh, for about 2 minutes.
Thank you. I think the first that we noticed was the fast forward of digitization. So everybody is now becoming much more savvy in terms of working from home, in terms of handling Zoom and Teams, and right across the economy, people have gotten used to clicking on code on access codes and things like that. So it's allowed, I think, a lot of information gathering, which helps, because supply chain is about information and how you manage that information across various legs. It allowed companies, I think, to also innovate during this time, because customers became a little more empathetic about the problems. Whereas in the past, they would not stand for delays in anything. I think now this pandemic has allowed many companies to actually improve their way of doing business with customer empathy. Remote working has upskilled all our workers, and I think we experience higher productivity. Maybe not so overtly, but certainly people became more responsive. And the downside to that was, everything at home became work as well at any time. So we had to worry about health and mental health. But those were the positive outcomes that I felt would help.
Thank you very much. And you were speaking about, I think you were speaking early so much about the mapping of supply chains and really understanding every aspect, also including the human dimensions, workforce challenges, which are absolutely fundamental, data and the use of data, and these sorts of issues you raised in your case study earlier. So thank you, Suresh. Okay, what about, I'd like to turn to government and the policy tools that government have at their disposal and they've been developing to help and support companies and supply chains moving freight. I'd open with two examples, but I'd like you to come, I'll ask you each to if there are any others that you'd like to talk about. One is the Australian government's the International Freight Assistance Mechanism, which started the day of Australia's lockdown pretty much, or 2 days later. On the same day, 92% of Australia's airline industry stopped, and that was devastating for Australia's supply chains, imports and exports. And the International Freight Assistance Mechanism has also seen the governments of the state governments, the territory governments and the Australian government through sort of people interested in supply chain, the business sides of each department and each government working together to really help importers and exporters deal with this crisis as far as possible. My work has also involved us with different high-value agricultural fisheries and exporters, high-value agricultural exporters and fishery exporters relying on air freight. And one of the things that we've really seen is the phenomenal change in the need for aggregation and consolidation, taking on new precedents in Australia because of the island nation, because of all of our issues to do with air freight and sea freight. Because as an island, of course, you can only move freight in and out using either sea or air, whereas countries that are not islands can use the other modes of transport. So there are government programs that are being developed to really attempt to support regions and the aggregation and consolidation of freight, often by companies that have never worked together. In fact, companies that see each other as competitors. So I'm wondering if you have any comments you'd like to make about, say, the policy environment and what government you've seen government do that is of interest to this notion of supply chain disruption. Is there anything anyone would like to contribute? Roberto.
Yes, I have a comment, not on something that I have seen, but on something that I hope we can start to see. I think, let's think about why companies tend to be vulnerable. They tend to be vulnerable because they run very lean operations. And why do they run lean operations? Because lean reduces cost, reduces expenses, waste, and therefore increases profit or allows companies to offer the products at a lower price, which makes them more competitive. Companies would be less reticent to keep safety stock of things or to build in redundancy if that didn't hit their bottom line so harshly. So I think of two things government can do to help in this regard. The first is that it can give companies some sort of tax break or tax incentive for investing in redundancy. For example, if I have one machine, but my resilience plan says that having a second machine would help in my robustness, I should be able to install that second machine, that redundancy machine, and get some sort of tax break for it. Because I am not doing it to produce more necessarily, I'm doing it so that I have some built-in redundancy. So otherwise you're being penalized for building in redundancy, which is something the government wants. The government wants your industry to be more robust. As similarly for inventory that is kept for safety reasons. Safety stock should be able to be a tax write-off. If I have $10,000 of inventory of a key element that I'm keeping there, it's enough that I'm already putting the money there so that I'm also taxed on top of it. If I get a break for that, that would be a good incentive. So that's something that I think can be done. The other thing that can be done, I think, applicable in this case only to those goods deemed strategically important, such as food, medicine, and basic utilities, water, power, etc., is to mandate a certain level of redundancy and robustness and safety stocks. For example, mandating that certain hospitals keep a minimum level of PPE, or that our water treatment facilities keep the chlorine they need to operate for at least a year, etc. So for critical things that would cost lives if they were to fail, I think redundancy and built-in mechanisms of resilience should be built in as instructed by the government.
Okay,
but not only for the basic ones.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to the final question, and you each have 1 minute maximum. But I'm going to ask you now, if there's one piece of advice you can offer Australian exporters, what would it be? Can I ask you to do this first, Suresh? It's only 1 minute. We've got a very tight timeline, but if you could please, one piece of advice.
Oops. All
Thank
right.
you.
One piece of advice is to understand your dependencies in your critical supply chains. And I think that you do a risk assessment of your supply chain. That's the way you do it. And you look for opportunities to increase market share. And a one size does not fit all. Through alliances and understanding the supply chain in total. For Southeast Asia, we are starting to see the Belt and Road Initiative from China coming through all the way from China to Singapore by land. So you can start to see the opportunities that could arise in engaging with the players there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Suresh. Vinh, I'm going to go to you last. Roberto, any quick one from you?
Yes, this is regarding how exporters can prepare. I think what Suresh said is right on the money. They need to understand where their vulnerability is. What is the single point of failure? What is the thing that if it goes wrong, is going to impact your business? And then try to address that risk. For some people, it may be the fact that they only have one customer. For some people, it may be that they only have one supplier, or they only have one port out of which they can export. Because you don't know where you're going to be hit. So if identify the weakest link in your chain, and then try to address that either by reinforcing it or duplicating it so you have redundancy. But that's going to be different depending from exporter to exporter. But it is a painful exercise, but I think it's necessary, and it should be very frank. Don't sugarcoat it, be really frank regarding what are your weaknesses.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Vinh, final comment from you, please.
Yes, thanks, Hermione. I think this is a blessing in disguise, to be honest. And my piece of advice for the company is they would need to really do the supply chain mapping and auditing if that have not been done before. And then really to look at across the four main staff in the supply chain process: plan, source, make, and deliver. So try to do the mapping of each of these steps in the supply chains and look at the opportunity to improve. So say, for example, for planning, looking at the, for whether or not shorter planning cycle can be done. And then from the source perspective, alternative supplier and sourcing market, alternative sourcing market and supplier, whether or not that can be identified. And in terms of make, we talk about onshoring and nearshoring. And like Suresh mentioned, for automation, digitization in the manufacturing process and operation in general. And in terms of deliver, looking at route optimization, and in terms of difficulty that we are facing in terms of shipping logistics, don't look at the buying individually, but look at consortium buying, making connection and collaboration with other similar shipper, for example, in order to implement the consortium buying of transport logistics. And having strategic partnership with the logistics service provider is another option. So really, all those come together very, very nicely in the different steps of the supply chain process, and that will help the firms moving forward.
Vin, it's fortunate that we have a few more sessions throughout the year where we can keep exploring these ideas. From my final comment, having worked in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry for a long time and working with different companies that see each other, even though they're down the road from each other, as competitors, we need aggregation, consolidation in regional areas. That's new to Australia, in my view. So I think that would be my one piece of advice. I would like to thank you, before I hand over to Jason Fitz, I would like to thank you, Suresh. Thank you, Vin. Thank you, Roberto. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you. I'd now like to introduce a vote of thanks from Jason Fitz, the Manager of China and Southeast Asia for Global Victoria. Over to you, Jason. Thank you.
Thank you, Hermione. And look, thank you all the speakers. I'm delighted to be here on behalf of Global Victoria, which is a proud partner of the Asia Society through our Trade Alliance program. Look, I think as we've heard today, the last couple of years has been marked by turbulence and disruption. And when we looked at that through the lens of this Global Victoria Trade Alliance program, we thought, how can we get clarity on the issues for Victorian exporters and other interested parties to help Victorian businesses steer their business through what will be, a challenging and obviously unprecedented year next year. As we've heard, logistics is the blood and veins of the world economy, something you don't notice when there isn't a problem, but now when there is a problem, we've all realised how important logistics is to us all. The challenges, I think, that we've been looking at in the discussion today, and some of the solutions, which I've been particularly interested in, nearshoring, onshoring, doing the dependency mapping and understanding, doing the risk assessments, the auditing of your logistics and your distributors and your supplier chains. That has been extraordinarily useful, I think, for us in government, but also I hope for many of the listeners who are listening in today to think about how they can actually restructure their businesses and adapt to what will be coming at us in the next year. Look, the focus, particularly on Southeast Asia, I think is very welcome in that Global Victoria has a strong focus on trade with Southeast Asia. We've got a relatively recent appointment of Commissioner Rebecca Hall, who oversees the 4 offices which Global Victoria has in Southeast Asia. So we've got a great interest in exports there. Imports as well are a big part of the Victorian economy from Southeast Asia. And so, look, in that context, logistics, Southeast Asia, and how we're going to be dealing with challenges next year, I think today's talk has been relevant and very illuminating. So, look, I'd like to thank our 2 guest speakers, Roberto and Suresh, and also the 2 Asia Society Supply Chain Fellows, Hermione and Vinh. I look forward to hearing more from all of you, but particularly our Supply Chain Fellows on logistics issues as they develop toward the end of this year and over next year as well. So thanks also to Andrew and James from the Asia Society team for putting on today. And I hope our audience have got as much out of this as I have.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Hermione, Vinh, Roberto, and Suresh for taking us through some of the current challenges and inherent complexities around supply chains. And as Jason said, it was also great to hear a lot of the practical solutions available to exporters as well. If there was anything any of the attendees missed on today's program, we'll be sharing the video of today's event next week. So please keep an eye out on Asia Society Australia's social channels for that. Thank you also to Jason and the team at Global Victoria for your support through the Global Victoria Trade Alliance initiative. And as mentioned, please keep an eye out for our next program in this series in March, which will be on building resilient supply chains. Before we leave you today, just a reminder that Asia Society's research arm, the Asia Society Policy Institute, has earlier this year released an interactive web tool, Supply Chains Shifting Indo-Pacific, which maps out the concrete policy measures that 17 economies in the region are taking to improve their investment climates, incentivize the movement of supply chains, and in some cases, encourage the reshoring of overseas business. On your screen, you'll be able to scan the QR code and explore how the app works. Currently, the geographic scope of the project includes 17 Indo-Pacific economies, Australia, Brunei, Cambodia, China, India, Indonesia, Japan, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, and Vietnam. Across these economies, over 180 policies have been mapped out in detail, including tax incentives, subsidies, and the creation of special economic zones, as well as to those limited to specific sectors, including information and communication technology, medical, automotive, and agriculture. The data and policies is being regularly updated and expanded over time, so please take time to check out the tool. That's a free resource for all exporters. This program also marks our 53rd and final program for the year. So a huge thank you to all of us who have followed us throughout the year, and in particular the members of Asia Society Australia for your continued support. A big thanks from myself to the team at Asia Society Australia, and a special shout out to my colleagues Eloise Dolan and Lena Deshen from the Asia Society Australia programs team. I wish you all a very happy festive season and look forward to the opportunity to come together for more programs in person in 2022. Until then, take care and we'll see you next year.